Diving right into this training session that is meant to include plyometric and multi-directional speed efforts. Now, literally the first thing I'm doing in the session is getting into these skipping variations. Now, I don't believe skipping variations are anything magical or really can improve technique, which I know people subscribe to. For me, they're just another variation of plyometric efforts that can be progressed in the same way as any other plyometric effort. Now you'll see I can start, or I am starting with stationary A skips, which can be scaled or progressed via vertical displacement as an example. So I can start with this lower threshold entry point as I'm beginning to warm up, and then I can progress in maybe a set 2 or 3. I can progress that vertical displacement to increase intensity. Another way to progress these A skips is with horizontal displacement. So if you are moving forward or using a transit A skip, then you can have an entry point of low horizontal displacement and then increase intensity by increasing that horizontal displacement or the speed at which you're doing that movement with high horizontal displacement, as you can see in some of this footage. Another skip variation that I really like is a straight leg skip. Now I can do this stationary as well. Can't really progress this vertical displacement, but I can get a nice little low threshold entry point and start getting hamstrings warmed up. In a similar way to the progression I mentioned about with horizontal displacement, I can move into a transit straight leg skip, but I'm not really able to progress horizontal distance until I get into the next thing I enjoy, that is a straight leg version, but it's more of a straight leg bound. It's not a skip. Now the straight leg bound, I can certainly progress in this way where I'm moving faster or covering more distance with each step in something that is faster force and more directed towards hamstrings. The last skip variation that I'm getting into is a lateral A skip. And those kind of sum up the three that I do most of the time: a linear A skip, lateral A skip, and a straight leg skip. In that same way I talked about progressing the linear A skip, the lateral A skip can be progressed with that horizontal displacement as well. So I could start with an initial set of some shorter displacement there and then build up the intensity by covering more ground horizontally with each step in that lateral A skip. In this next footage, you're seeing a high knee carioca, but it's done in a way that I enjoy much more so than I think what is classically seen, which is maybe a non-purposeful high knee carioca, which is just not covering a lot of ground, but it's just like a fast up and down of the leg as you sort of cross behind, cross in front. I've come to like the high knee carioca as a really nice plyometric effort that places the foot in some interesting positions as you cross in front or cross behind. So when I cross behind, I'm really trying to use that as a higher intensity plyometric effort and engage with the ground with some stiffness and intensity as I push and try to cover ground and then lift that leg over. So instead of just it being sort of a non-purposeful movement, in my opinion, I like to turn that into more of a plyometric effort in my training sessions. Continuing to progress intensity and build towards these higher intensity activities, which honestly the training session includes a lot of variety, more so because I'm trying to use this for education purposes here. But the next footage you're seeing are these defensive slides with my hands behind my back. So I'm putting my hands behind my back to isolate this more to the lower body and not have hands kind of flying all over the place sometimes, which can kind of aid in helping you get into and out of the cuts. So to isolate more of this to a lower body driven challenge, I'm just putting the hands behind my back. And we can see here that what is the benefit of doing these slides? The main focus, as you'll see in other footage, is I'm trying to place that foot outside of center of mass and challenge myself to then redirect my force in the opposite direction. So yes, this is a defensive slide, but the focus mainly is that final foot contact. So I'm just building up speed to then make that challenge a higher impulse challenge of placing that foot outside of center of mass, accepting or attenuating that force and being able to propel myself in the opposite direction. This next footage with a similar theme here as the defensive slides, it definitely is focused on this final foot contact or aggressively punching that leg outside of center of mass and redirecting myself in a different direction. And I'm just doing that by sort of walking into this cut, if you will. So I'm trying to emphasize more of a concentric propulsive element of this and still placing that foot in a similar direction. So I'm just trying to emphasize this lateral movement, but just in a little bit of a different way. Getting into a higher intensity plyometric in this next footage. Now, similar to the skips we talked about in the beginning, this is a fast stretch shortening cycle activity, but definitely at a higher intensity or hopefully higher forces. And I would call this just a forward repeated jump that I'm trying to get as little amount of ground or as low of a ground contact time as possible and cover as much vertical displacement as possible, more so than horizontal. So you can see that I'm moving forward in these repeated jumps, but I'm not emphasizing as much of that horizontal displacement. It's more of that vertical displacement. So I'm trying to be as elastic as possible without flexing at knees and hips as much and isolating more to the foot ankle complex here. And one thing I will emphasize, and something that's super underrated in your plyometric efforts, is your arm action. So I'm really prepared before I hit the ground, making sure my arms are back far enough to get ready to help with my arms immediately when I hit the ground, to use my arms to help propel myself up into the air. Now that is, I think, super key and an underrated piece of your plyometric and your multi-directional speed stuff, is how you coordinate your arms. Showing one of my favorite plyometric efforts next, and that is something that would be kind of considered a long jump if you're looking at track and field. So you are running into a 1 foot takeoff into a 2 foot landing. Now, several reasons why I love this plyometric effort. Similar to sport, you're always dealing in sport with some sort of entry velocity, and maybe not always, but commonly in sport, you're dealing with this entry velocity, i.e. you're doing something like running or sliding and then performing some sort of plyometric effort. So I have to deal with this horizontal velocity coming in and then perform this plyometric effort. So there is this redirection of force that you have to hopefully utilize that speed to your advantage and then redirect that in some sort of vertical and horizontal capacity. So forces are definitely high on that one leg, especially if you're progressing speed, which is the way I would progress intensity. So whether that's the same distance and then you're just increasing how fast you're trying to move in that same distance, or you can use a longer distance to just build up to a higher speed and then take off on that one leg. The other reason why I really like this sort of plyometric effort is it kind of decreases the amount of ground contacts that are high intensity. Now granted, running into something like this, you are getting these contacts that are higher intensity, but if I compare this to what I'll show next with something like a transit hop, where I'm doing repeated hops and moving forward, that's a lot of ground contacts that are really high intensity. So for something like this, where you can just not only better represent what is seen in sport, but you could take away some of those higher intensity ground contacts by not doing repeated hops and just running into then one higher intensity plyometric effort. I think that can be an advantage in your programming. As mentioned, the next thing I'm showing here is forward repeated hopping. So hopping to me is just taking off and landing on the same leg. Now, I do like hopping, but I'll continue to kind of caution folks on how intense repeated hopping is, especially when you have to cycle that leg through and you are taking off and landing on one leg. So that is a lot of force that you're going to have to deal with. So being careful with hops. Yes, hops are good in training. I don't think they're essential for everyone. It is the almost highest intensity version of this sort of plyometric, where you are kind of spending a little bit more time on the ground and it's really stressful to foot, ankle, knee, and hip. But again, great plyometric effort, but being careful with how we prescribe it. The last exercises I performed in this training session were these acceleration drills out of different positions. Now, the first thing I'll stress is I like to think about acceleration as more of an equation than it is a position. So acceleration just means the rate of change in speed versus, I know in track and field, this would definitely be more important and popular to think of hey, the particular position that is perfect for acceleration and that acceleration lean. But in sport, there's just changes in speed that happen that I would consider acceleration. So really I should call this just running from a stationary start, and in that running you are then accelerating, especially from a stationary start. That initial movement, that is the highest rate of change in speed, so you are representing acceleration well. The first variation that I'm doing is emphasizing propelling off the front foot. So I'm trying to shift weight over the front foot and then push off that foot as the main driver. And another thing I'll talk about or say too is emphasizing where your eyes are. So I know in track and field, more emphasis may be placed on maybe head down, eyes down towards the ground. But in sport, I like to emphasize keeping your eyes up. That's just what's real in sport. That's where the action is. So in this exercise, I am having my eyes up, and I'm not so much concerned with how much of a lean I can get, because if you think of basketball players, a lot of times it is a more upright position that they're using as they try to accelerate around people, especially with the ball in their hand. So this first version, again, I'm emphasizing that propulsion off of front foot. The next variation I'm showing, I think, is something that's a bit slept on in your multi-directional speed or your acceleration work, is again this variation of positions that you are accelerating out of. So I'm emphasizing the back foot as your propulsive or your initial propulsive step. And there's a number of reasons for that. We definitely see examples, and we're definitely seeing issues with folks taking false steps, which definitely happens, and that is okay. Repositioning that foot behind you to then propel by somebody is certainly creating an advantage, but I don't think we do enough work to train that position, and that's what I'm trying to do here. So I'm placing that weight more so on the back foot and then coordinating my arms accordingly. So you'll see that pushing off the back foot, I then use that to propel, and then that front leg lifts and then repositions to hopefully a more positive shin angle to get that second step really getting me going and covering some ground as I try to move forward and project myself forward. So a really underrated piece to include in your acceleration training is, yes, emphasize that front foot, weight on the front foot, but also emphasize propelling off the back foot as that initial propulsive step. The last variation is more of this lateral start and looks more like a baseball player stealing a base. So yes, I'm in this stationary position and I'm going to perform a directional step. Now I understand that in sport, we're not in this stationary position most often, other than maybe this baseball player stealing a base, and even in our linear starts, we're doing something else and then having to get into that acceleration. So in subsequent videos, I'll show how to use motion into these starts, but stationary starts can be a nice place to start your progression and then progress by adding in movement into those propulsive steps. But for this last example and using a directional step, I am pushing off one foot as my driver, and then that foot, the other leg, is lifting and directing myself in the direction I want to go. So whether that's left foot push and then right is serving as sort of your rudder, opening up and getting you going in that opposite direction. Just like that back foot example I showed before, where you're propelling off the back foot and then you're repositioning the front leg to propel you and project you forward with a more positive shin angle. In this lateral example, I have this propulsive step and then a repositioning of a leg and hopefully getting a positive shin angle to then project myself in the direction that I'm trying to go.